back to the shop, guys. As you may know, supercharging the C5 Corvette is an excellent way to add another 200 horsepower without affecting drivability or fuel economy. But is the C5's automatic or manual transmission up to the task of managing the delivery of 500 horsepower to the pavement? That's a super important question and one not to be taken lightly. For the 6-speed manual Corvette, I've got 3 years of experience, which I can help guide you. But for the automatic transmission, I don't have any direct experience. So I reached out to Josh and Andy at A&A Corvette and Doug at ECS, and I picked their brains so that I could tell you what sort of guidance they give to their customers day in and day out. We're going to talk about both transmissions and a whole lot more next.
Toys for life.
Depending on the dyno, the operator, and the location, stock C5s generally put down around 310 horsepower to the rear tires. Now, if you've been following the videos on my channel about supercharging your C5, and if you haven't, that's okay, because I'll include them in your upper right-hand corner, then you know by adding just the basic A&A Corvette or ECS supercharger kit to your C5, you can expect a huge bump in that rear wheel horsepower number to just over 500 horsepower. Let's walk through some general assumptions that apply to the durability of the transmission and the engine for that matter as well before we go any further. First off, anytime you increase the horsepower on any car, you're going to increase the rate at which things wear. There's just no way around it. Second, supercharger kits like A&A and ECS utilize centrifugal superchargers. Now these types of superchargers continue to build more and more horsepower the higher up in the RPM range that you climb. Now, all things being equal, if you're the kind of driver that spends 90% of your time way up at the high RPM range, that's just going to cause a whole lot more wear versus if you were driving like a grandma most of the time. Well, maybe not that kind of grandma. Third, C5 Corvettes, even with stock horsepower levels, can sometimes experience violent wheel hop or drivetrain shake. Now, when you up the horsepower another couple hundred, that's going to make that shaking event, if it occurs, even more violent, making it even more critical that anytime you feel the onset of shake or vibration, that you let off the throttle. So without any further ado, are the two types of C5 transmissions up to the task of handling the 500 horsepower that you can expect with the base A&A or ECS kit? And the answer to both questions is yes, but with a few conditions and a little bit of caution. Starting out with the manual transmission, it's absolutely strong enough. So long as you don't beat the daylights out of it. Now, the clutch is not nearly as strong, but it will hold the power for a while, so long as you tread a little bit lightly and take a few precautions. The first precaution, use street tires. They don't stick nearly as well as drag radials, and in most cases they'll act like a fuse and they will spin before you overpower the clutch. Second precaution, C5 clutches aren't that great, even at stock power levels. So don't go out there and try to feather the clutch off the line with a ton of power in order to pull off some sort of a stall converter like launch. Instead, make sure that you're using relatively low RPMs and you fully disengage the clutch before you hammer it. Third precaution, as you're shifting through those gears and you're up at the 5,500 to 6,500 RPM level, make sure that you fully disengage the clutch before you hammer the throttle, because if you don't, the engine's going to overpower the clutch and sing a song that you really don't want to hear. Another manual transmission note to be aware of, once you supercharge your LS engine, it's no longer going to run out of breath at 5,800 RPMs. It's going to want to rev all the way to 6,500 or more if you'll let it. Problem is, LS clutches are just notorious for not really liking to be shifted much above 6,000 RPM. And if you start shifting at 62, 63, 6,400 RPM, you may find that for the first time ever, your clutch pedal starts sticking to the floor. Now, if you give it 10-15 seconds, it will come back up, but it's a little alarming when that happens. So what you're going to want to do if you start to experience that is simply start experimenting by lowering the RPMs at which you shift at until you find the threshold that your clutch can tolerate. If your clutch is tired, or you just want to bite the bullet and upgrade your clutch at the same time as you're installing the supercharger, then you're going to want to talk to the manufacturers to see which clutch matches up with the horsepower levels you're going to be running and your intended use. Now, if you're going to drive the heck out of this thing and be pretty aggressive, then the twin disc clutch is probably the one you want. Also, if you decide you want to wait until your clutch is actually wore out before you install an upgrade, then don't worry, because the process of installing a supercharger and the process of installing a clutch are different enough that there's not a whole lot of redo when putting the clutch in after the fact. So go with whatever scenario works best for your situation. What about C5s that came with an automatic transmission? Now, they can either die of a catastrophic failure or they can slowly wear out over time. To prevent a catastrophic failure, we're just going to follow a lot of the same guidance that I gave you for the manual transmission. Number one, don't beat the daylights out of it. Number two, make sure that you use street tires so they can kind of act like a fuse. And number three, anytime you feel like you might get some drivetrain shake or wheel hop, make sure you let off the throttle. To help make sure your transmission doesn't die prematurely, make sure in your instrument panel / gauge cluster, when you kind of filter through the different parameters, you can find the automatic transmission temperature on there and try to make sure yours stays below 200 degrees. Because as you can see by this chart, the higher you get above 200 degrees, the shorter the life of your transmission. Lastly, I reached out to two of the most respected shops that sell supercharger kits for the C5 Corvette, and I asked them the following question. Is the stock C5 Corvette transmission in good working order, stout enough to hold up for a reasonable amount of time to the power that a base 500 horsepower supercharger kit can put out on the street using street tires? And I made it clear that we're not talking about drag radials, drag tires on a prepared drag strip track. Andy from A&A Corvette replied back with, mileage and year both make a difference. Around 2001, the C5 transmission's internals were improved. I would have no problem recommending our supercharger kit to someone with a 2001 Corvette with 50,000 miles, so long as it's been well maintained. If someone wanted to do a 1997 Corvette with 100,000 miles plus, then I would tell them that a transmission rebuild is going to be in their near future. Josh from A&A replied back with the following. I would ask them if it has over 100,000 miles and if it's been serviced at 50,000 miles. If it has not been serviced and it has over 100,000 miles, it's probably not going to last very long with aggressive driving. He went on to say, if the transmission is in good shape and it shifts well, stay below 550 rear wheel horsepower, and they tend to last a long time with a good tune and keep the temperatures under 200 degrees. Josh further adds, once you get to 600 rear wheel horsepower or higher, he strongly recommends you speak to RPM Transmissions, let them know your intentions, and they can probably hook you up. I also asked Doug from East Coast Supercharging the same question, and he said, the stock automatic transmissions typically go 100,000 miles after supercharging on street cars. It's not something that we've had a problem with very often. So I'd put a lot of faith in what those three gentlemen said, because those two shops have been in business for a long time, and if you're familiar with the C5 world, those shops have terrific reputations. But one thing you really need to keep in mind is automatic transmissions are extremely complicated devices with a lot of moving parts, and your transmission might last 100,000 miles after supercharging, or it might die after 10,000 miles. There's absolutely no way anyone can tell you for sure beforehand. Well guys, that's going to do it for this one. If you learned something, please hit that subscribe button below and the thumbs up. And as always, thanks for watching.